In my FX6 review, I might have said something like this.
We need really robust camera control apps, preferably for iPad, with multicam support, settings transfer, rec control, etc. In an ideal world, I'd be running an FX6 and a couple of FX3 from an iPad, controlling and monitoring the whole camera setup from one big screen. But that future is nowhere in sight.
Well, I'm pleased to share that this future is here. Well, kind of. Not really. But at least there's hope now. With the latest versions of Monitor and Control app and camera firmware, you can simultaneously and wirelessly monitor and control up to 4 select Sony cameras from an iPad. I'm going to tell you how to set it up and give my review of the app and its features. Now, there's going to be a lot of criticism here, so I want to start with giving praise to Sony for actually listening to user feedback, for constantly improving their cameras through firmware updates and rolling out brand new features, albeit at a somewhat glacial pace. But I'm only ever critical about brands which products actually use all the time and love, in order to provide feedback to make the products even better. And so, in this spirit of positivity, let's roast this app. First of all, we are only going to talk about the multicam feature of the Monitor and Control app, and that only works with an iPad. Any iPad will do as long as it runs iPadOS 16 or later. I did my testing on a 6th gen iPad mini, which I love and use for all my video related apps, and here it is running right here, right now. Second, you'll need to download the Monitor and Control app, and if you don't see it in the App Store, most likely it's not available in your region. I only know this because I recently moved and had to switch App Store regions in order to get it to show up. Sony had a little hiccup with version 5 of the firmware for the FX6, but now it's available to download again. You can also use this app with Sony Burano, FX30, A7S III, Alpha 1 and A9 III. I don't have those cameras available for testing, but I imagine that for the mirrorless hybrids the process will be virtually identical to the FX3. And Burano shares the OS with the FX6, so we should have all the bases covered here. All in all, you can connect up to 4 of these cameras, which is neat and probably the most you'll need for a 2 or 3 person interview. I'm using it right now to record myself with 2 cameras. Alright, let's talk about connecting your cameras. For our purpose here, which is multicam, there's basically 3 ways to connect your camera. By far the easiest one is Wi-Fi tethering to the iPad, but of course that requires you to have an iPad with cellular connectivity. Like the vast majority of Apple customers, I bought a Wi-Fi only iPad because if I ever need to use mobile data, I just tether to my iPhone. But of course that won't work in this case. If you are one of those foresighted people that bought a cellular iPad, you just need to enable Wi-Fi hotspot, connect your cameras to it and Bob's your uncle. I'll explain how to connect cameras a bit later in the video. So, for the rest of us, that leaves only 2 options, and both of them require an external router. If you are shooting at home or at an office, that might not be a problem. But if you are out in the field somewhere, you'll need to, of course, have a router handy and also provide its power and connectivity. Now, the upside of wired connection is, of course, it will be the most stable one. But the downsides are 1. Wires, duh, and second, not all cameras support it. Specifically, cameras with the A7S III DNA don't support wired connectivity, but the sports photography hybrids do. Out of all these cameras, only Burano has a dedicated Ethernet port, but the others can easily accommodate through a simple USB-C to Ethernet adapter that is like 20 quid on Amazon. I just said quid for the first time in my life. Do I get a British passport now? Keep in mind that you'll need 1 adapter for each camera and 1 for the iPad itself. So if you are using all 4 cameras, your router needs to have 5 LAN ports. If you are going the wired route, the connection is pretty straightforward. You just need to enable wired LAN in network settings and also enable camera control. Then, once you have everything hooked up, open the app, enable multicam monitoring, and connect your cameras one by one. To connect a camera for the first time, you'll need to authenticate it. And for that, you need to use the iPad's camera to scan a QR code displayed on your camera's screen. Go into Network Settings again and look for Access Authentication. Just use whatever default values there are and just get it to show the QR code. If wired connection is a no-go, that leaves us with only one option, the one that all these cameras support and the one I've used: Wi-Fi.
My wife.
First of all, and I learned this the hard way, make sure you have a very simple and short Wi-Fi password, because you are going to be entering it through a worst interface imaginable, and you might have to do it several times. If you still have a stock Wi-Fi configuration that came with your router from your ISP and you have a password like this, you are entering a world of pain.
I'm not. A world of pain.
Okay, so the next order of business is connecting the cameras to a router. Let's start with the FX6. Go to Network menu and find Wireless LAN settings and put it in station mode, whatever the hell that means. Then go back up a level and enable camera control in the station mode settings. Then in the same menu, scan for networks and connect to your Wi-Fi network. On the FX3, the menus are just a tiny bit easier to understand and the order of operations is very much the same. You need to enable Wi-Fi, find and connect to your network, and then enable remote shooting in the network settings. Now the confusing bit is that it's called PC remote function, which makes no sense because there's no PC involved at any stage of the process. Sony menus, I guess. When connecting a camera for the first time, you'll need to go through the same authentication process as in wired connection. So if you skipped over that part, use the timestamp below to navigate back to it. So that's all in regards to connecting your cameras to the app. Could this process be any less elegant?
Could we be more white trash?
Now I have to save some energy for the closing rant, so I'll make this quick. Sony, guys, please, onegai shimasu. Have you ever paired an AirTag or AirPods to an iPhone? Yeah, it takes one tap and like 5 seconds. It needs to be like that. All those weird settings and checks for authentication, you need to do that stuff under the hood. You need to abstract all that stuff away and make it easy for the end user. In fact, ease of use is even more important to filmmakers than just to regular consumers. Because on set we just don't have the mental bandwidth to jump through all of these hoops. In this day and age, you just can't expect people to refer to a manual. There's just no reason why it needs to be this hard to connect a camera to an app. So just in the most general terms, the app is called Monitor and Control, and yeah, it kind of does what it says on the tin. When it comes to wireless monitoring, the biggest concern is of course latency. And I'm happy to report that during my testing on a home Wi-Fi network, the latency was fine. Actually, the latency was better than your typical HDMI latency that you usually get on cheaper external monitors. The problem was not the latency, but the stability of the signal. It just couldn't hold a rock-solid 25 FPS. In just a half an hour of testing, I've experienced several major stutters and a couple of complete camera disconnects. But this app is not intended for focus pulling or critical image evaluation, and it would be unreasonable to have such expectations. After all, there's a reason why top-of-the-line image transmission systems cost as much as they do, more than these cameras in some instances. When in multicam view, the feed switches into single-digit FPS, and again, it's okay, I'm not mad about it. Because again, it's not intended as a Stream Deck replacement. It's just so that you are aware of framing and the general status of the cameras. If you are experiencing bad lag and dropouts, most likely you just have a poor reception or 2.4 GHz band in your area is overcrowded, which is often the case. Make sure to set your cameras in the network settings to prefer the 5 GHz band, provided of course your router supports dual band connectivity. I have the FX3 on a 5 GHz band and it's noticeably more stable, albeit not perfect. My FX6 doesn't support 5 GHz band and transmission on it is noticeably worse. I was bummed out to discover that there are actually two SKUs of the FX6, the V variant and the T variant. And the T variant doesn't support 5 GHz. I don't know what the deal is, probably some kind of regional licensing crap as always, but I'm just kinda bummed out that my FX6 turned out to be slightly castrated. Just a little bit. In terms of camera control, what you can expect varies significantly from camera to camera. You can trigger recording on either all cameras or selectively, so that's neat. And there's clear rec status indication, which is handy. Basic exposure settings are available on all cameras, but that is of course subject to hardware limitations. For example, on the FX6 you can control the built-in ND filter, but of course if you have a screw-on ND on the FX3 you'll have to control it manually, which makes matching exposure a bit trickier. However, some settings are grayed out with no explanation. For example, on the FX6 I couldn't change frame rate, recording resolution or codec. Although I could see the settings, I couldn't change them. There's also no way to enter special recording modes from the app, like SNQ, time-lapse, proxy or cache recording. Weirdly enough, the app lets you switch out the assignable buttons for the FX6, which seems unnecessary. There's a comprehensive focusing screen, but I fail to see the utility of it considering the transmission quality. But there is touch to focus functionality and you can adjust the speed and sensitivity of the autofocus. So I imagine you can do some controlled focus racks from an iPad when the camera is inaccessible, rigged up somewhere on the crane. There is also an interesting overlay called Focus Map, which is sort of like a heat map for focus. What's hot is closer to the camera and what's cold is farther away from the camera, and what's in sharp focus is transparent. It's neat, I guess, but again I just can't imagine anyone using this app to pull focus on set. Playback is a total mess, which is unsurprising considering Sony treats it as an afterthought even on their cameras. First off, the FX3 just straight up doesn't support playback, no idea why. On the FX6 the functionality is buggy and limited. From the main camera screen you can tap playback, but it doesn't show the clip thumbnails. What happens is the camera enters the playback mode, but the interface is only shown on the camera itself, and the app just gets the video feed. It looks completely broken. You kind of can play back the latest clip, but you can't navigate between clips or scrub through them. There is another way to enter playback, and that is through the app's menu. That also has the multicam view, so theoretically you can play back the same clip shot from multiple angles. It appears to have scrubbing functionality, and at least you can see clip names, albeit not thumbnails. But to play back the files from the FX6 you need proxies, which by the way you can't enable through the app. So all in all, playback is a total disaster. In terms of overlays, there's the usual array of tools that you can find on any external monitor, and you can choose up to 3 as your favorites. There's a waveform monitor that you can move around and scale, but it's tied to the LUT you are monitoring, which limits its usefulness severely. That really applies to all exposure tools here. You need to constantly be switching your viewing LUT on and off in order to use them, which makes it slow and annoying. Both cameras support viewing LUTs, and you can switch them out in the app or even load new LUTs through the iPad. There's also histograms, grid lines and anamorphic D-squeeze, which funnily enough offers more options than the one in the cameras. But the thing I really want to talk about is false color. Yes, finally! I did a video ranking all the exposure tools from worst to best, and it has criminally low views by the way, so give it some love over here. In that video I named false color the second best exposure tool, so I'm really glad it's available in this app. Now there's a way to exposure match multiple cameras quickly and precisely without actually touching the cameras. Unless of course you need to fiddle with the screw-on and D-filters or manual lenses. But there is a couple of major problems with this false color implementation. First of all, the quality kinda sucks, which is to be expected given that it's based on a heavily compressed wireless transmission. The second problem is that false color, same as waveform, measures what you are monitoring. You can switch it to log monitoring, but then you need to go and disable the LUT. So there's no way to quickly switch between false color and LUTed image, which makes this feature extremely cumbersome to use. Sony, let me give you a piece of feedback. We never want to see false color applied to the image post-LUT. Never. We only want to see the exposure of what is actually being recorded on the card, and that is log. False color is a tool of a cinematographer, and as such it needs to be log-based. And people who shoot baked-in color profiles will manage just fine with zebras and histograms. The last thing I'll say about false color is this. Sony, why don't you add it to your cameras? It can't be that hard. Plus, Canon has false color on their competing Cinema EOS cameras. At the very least, I think the Cinema line, the FX3, FX6 and FX9 should have false color built into the camera. Or what, do you think it's some kind of high-end cinema feature? No, it's built into every cheap external monitor. As professional camera operators, we need false color built into our cameras, and we need it to monitor the log signal ignoring the LUT. Oh Sony, and if you want to outdo the competition, put L-Zone in your cameras. It's the single best available exposure tool today, and it's like false color and light meter had a baby. Now let's talk about the features I would like to see in the app. One major missing feature for me is exposure matching and white balance matching. Ideally, I would set up exposure on one camera and just sync all the others to it. Now, I understand there are cases and hardware limitations that make it impossible for this process to be completely automatic. But if, for instance, I have 4 FX6s with Sony lenses, I should be able to set the exposure on one of them, say a master camera, and then slave all the others to it with one button. But if I have a mix of cameras, at least let me attempt to copy-paste basic settings like f-stop, frame rate, shutter speed, ISO, and just pop up an error message saying which settings couldn't be applied. An even more useful feature would be white balance syncing. So while I'm sitting here with the app, it would be cool if I could just raise a gray card and have all the cameras take white balance reading off of it. Another feature I'd love to see is settings transfer, or as I call it, camera cloning. Suppose I have an FX3, the second up brings their FX3, and we also rent a couple of FX3s. There's a bunch of under-the-hood settings in the camera like noise reduction and color profile tweaks, which affect the final image in a subtle way. If your camera settings are not identical, you're basically asking for trouble in post-production. So it would be a tremendous time saver if I could just copy settings from one camera and paste it onto the other cameras of the same model. Alright, with all that's been said, what's the final verdict on this app? And I gotta be honest with you, it's not great. Despite the 2.0 designation, this app looks and feels like an alpha version. The connection process is needlessly cumbersome and the functionality is limited and sometimes broken. I mean, it's a free app and it works with no extra add-ons or wires, and that's better than nothing, I guess. But if you compare it to camera control apps from Red or Ari, well, it's just crap. It's ugly as hell and too hard to use. And I'm struggling to understand why that is always the case with Sony. And most other Japanese brands for that matter. For some reason or another, they just can't seem to understand UI and UX. They are tremendous engineers. I mean, these cameras are technological marvels. But when it comes to building a human interface to operate these marvels, they are basically in the Stone Age. And I just don't see why that has to be the case. My theory is that the software is built by the same engineers who build hardware. And that is how we end up with these obscure interfaces that are made for engineers by engineers. Their thinking is very system-centric. You need to learn the system from the inside out and then adapt to using it. It reminds me of that RTFM mentality that you see in PC circles, that the human needs to adapt to the computer and not the other way around. But these cameras are creative tools. You have people coming from all kinds of backgrounds, theater, writing, acting, what have you. They don't speak tech, they have no idea how these cameras work. For them it's just a tool to accomplish a creative endeavor. And that's not even the main issue. Look, I am a tech geek. I can read the manual, I can troubleshoot, and I can get under the hood if need be. The older I get, the less I want to do that stuff, but at least I can. But the last place I want to do that on is a film set. It is such a high-stress environment, your capacity to focus is stretched so thin that you just can't deal with this fiddly crap. Filmmaking tools need to be like Kalashnikov rifle, simple, reliable and predictable, otherwise they just won't get used. Take this app for example. It's fine to toy around with, sitting in your comfortable homemade YouTube studio, but would I bring it to a paid gig? No. Just imagining having 10 people waiting around on me while I'm knee-deep in Sony menus trying to troubleshoot the connection just gives me anxiety. For me to use this, it needs to be easy, stable and functional. Make it paid if you have to, but it needs to be up there with the best apps of its kind. And just talk to industry professionals, just ask us how we want to use these tools. Take false color for example. This implementation was clearly made by somebody who doesn't shoot video for a living. If Sony would just ask somebody with a modicum of experience, they would tell them that it needs to be log-based. And please hire some UI and UX people. If your cameras had the UI of Blackmagic or Red, they would absolutely dominate the marketplace. Because the hardware is already there. Thanks for watching.